Welcome, everybody, to a brand new episode of the Jams D podcast where we spin the jams and spill the tea. And today we're coming at you with two brand new reviews for two brand new records. We're going to be talking today about the latest album from Gorillaz, their newest album, Cracker Island. And we're also going to be talking about the latest record from Algiers, Shook. But today we're going to be capping off with Gorillaz first and foremost. And you know, I feel like it's fitting that we're coming around talking about this new album, you and I specifically, because our opinions on Gorillaz are kind of well documented at this point, because last year we actually had an episode where we talked about Damon Albarn's two main musical projects, that of Blur and Gorillaz. And we sort of used that as a thesis statement to kind of explore him, his music, and why we have kind of, even at this band's peak, or what people consider to be this band's peak, we specifically are, I'd say, not exactly the hottest, even though we have a certain appreciation for them. But that said, I will say, leading off this discussion, because of the last Gorillaz album being far better received than the other records that kind of surround this in the last, 8-ish years, I think I had some reason to expect something that maybe perhaps was a bit more alluring to someone like you or I, who are not exactly, head over heels in love for this band.
Okay, Jake, I always appreciate when you do it in the most roundabout way possible. You're just trying to set up gently that you're not into the new Gorillaz album. And look, neither am I, but we'll get into it, okay? Because we're not coming at this from the perspective of, boo, Damon Albarn. Whatever.
Yeah,
I think Damon
I didn't
Albarn
want it
is
to make us seem like we're just like, oh, we weren't gonna like this no matter what.
well, forget that. Damon Albarn is a really fascinating figure. He is one of the most fascinating figures in the last, 30 years of music, really. I mean, here's someone who came along at the right time, came along with these incisive, very witty, very catchy, sort of social satire pop music songs about life in the UK with Blur in the early to mid 90s as well. Ended up being caught in the middle of a moment, essentially, where his band became basically the biggest band, or one of the biggest bands in the UK, kind of an emblem of, or one of the emblems of, the relationship between kind of where Britain was at culturally and, in terms of like the social culture of Britain and, the UK at the end of the 20th century, all that sort of stuff. And, the evolving pop music trends as well, how they were differing from pop music trends in the US, but also how they were, taking from them, and the relationship there. Loads of interesting kind of social, cultural, even anthropological stuff. We've kind of talked about it. We did that, as Jake has alluded to. We did a great record club where we talked about Blur's 13 and Gorillaz' Plastic Beach. We picked those albums because they both kind of represent points in those respective artists' career where they essentially kind of stepped beyond the template they had established for themselves with previous more successful records, and basically did something a little bit darker, a little bit more ambitious, a little bit more thematically difficult, maybe might be a more fitting word, even if it has a kind of pejorative implication.
And we did really like both of those albums, for the record.
Absolutely. And so Gorillaz have been in a really interesting place culturally, where they have, so Gorillaz evolved essentially out of the ashes of Blur. Blur broke up in the early 2000s, but by the time they had done that, Gorillaz, as a side project for Damon Albarn, and of course his creative collaborator Jamie Hewlett, had already basically become an established identity, an established product, and an established concept, with the famous sort of visual art accompaniment and the characters and the ideas and the whole creative thing that Gorillaz are, that
The
really
lore.
interesting. Yeah, exactly. And it was like with those three records that they put out in the 2000s, with their self-titled, with Demon Days, and with Plastic Beach, it was like each step was this fascinating evolution of both this interesting new musical direction for Damon specifically, who, towards the tail end of Blur, especially with that last album, Think Tank, was kind of starting to pull a bit more from strange alternative sources that weren't, more like a traditional sort of British pop music, but starting to pull from, alternative R&B and styles of music that went beyond the UK essentially. And it's starting to become a little bit more of a jack of all trades sort of artist, right? And Gorillaz was the avenue that he used to kind of fully pursue those interests, and it was to great success. I mean, that's the thing about Gorillaz, is that they established themselves as this, cool multimedia gimmick. That's great, but also they were this kind of massive cultural synthesis, this massive cultural kind of synergistic point where you had all these different collaborators coming together, different forms of music were being kind of collided together, and you had these big sweeping records which were these really sort of ambitious collisions of, often, many, a handful, even up to a dozen of different musical reference points. And one of the cool things that made Gorillaz feel so, I guess, important, for lack of a better word, or at least like, realistic as a musical prospect, was the fact that they weren't just kind of dipping their toes into all these different reference points and saying, ha, we can do this really, really well. But they were actually getting involved with people who were from those scenes, bringing those people on as well, to actually be a part of that creative process. And so Gorillaz as a construct and as a concept, as their careers gone on, and particularly with those bigger records that they've made, kind of became this sort of weird sort of, I guess, musical utopian ideal. It was never like something that Damon Albarn, thankfully he's someone who has some measure of, what's tasteful, that sort of thing. It's not the sort of thing that he's ever kind of really gotten an inflated ego about, but that kind of is what Gorillaz is. And I think Gorillaz has this universal appeal and that has kept them relevant with younger audiences as well, because of how at the cutting edge they are and how willing they are to evolve in order to sort of capitalize on and feel like an organic part of the changing musical landscape. And that's always been really, really interesting. And when you look at the more recent Gorillaz records, and I think especially it really kicked off with 2017's Humans, which was, that was a hugely anticipated album, right?
Oh, yeah.
I remember the rollout to that record, because it was the first proper Gorillaz record, I think about 7 years at that point. They put out The Fall after Plastic Beach, but that was kind of like I think a sort of a side album, wasn't sort of a main project.
Yeah.
This was really the first
Not
thing.
a canonical release.
Yeah, this was really the first thing that they put out since the major proper Gorillaz album since Plastic Beach. People were heavily anticipating it. I remember the singles as well were eclectic, they were colorful, they had all these kind of crazy diverse collaborators. They're from Vince Staples to Popcorn to Grace Jones to even Noel Gallagher and Jenny Beth of Savages, and all these other amazing collaborators came together on this record. And people were underwhelmed by it. I mean, I was underwhelmed by it as well. But then again, I wasn't really that underwhelmed by it because I was never a fully fledged Gorillaz fan. I'm not going to go into all the personal reasons why Gorillaz have never connected with me, because I want to keep it focused to where we're at today. But I thought that record was, it didn't have as many of the high points of their previous records to me. So it did feel a little bit underwhelming, but I was surprised to see how much animosity that album got. And in particular, I think as the dust has settled as well, people have, I think, looked on that record even more coldly as time has passed, this big bloated thing, but it felt like, the logical sort of conclusion, or the logical next step to where Gorillaz were going with how their albums were just getting more and more expansive and more, focused around that collaborative nature. And so Gorillaz have approached the sort of saturation point, I guess you could say, where, it became Gorillaz, in expanding their identity so vastly to encompass all these different musical traditions and all these different collaborators, kind of started to feel less like a musical act and more like a musical streaming service in a weird...
I was going to say a playlist.
Well, kind of a playlist, but I think almost a streaming service in and of themselves. And because they almost became this directory for all these different artists and all these different sorts of styles, whereby you had less of a kind of singular, coherent individual identity. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's kind of an innovative idea, I suppose. And Blur actually
Hmm.
leaned into that more and more with the Song Machine series of single releases and EPs, right? Where it was just this idea of just like, let's just churn out all these songs, churn out these collaborations one after the other, and let's not worry about feeding them together into an album tableau. Let's just kind of put them out. And eventually they were compiled into an album, the Song Machine Volume 1. But as they were released, as we experienced them, they were just these individual songs. And that felt for a while to me like it was going to be the future of Gorillaz. Gorillaz kind of feel like they have outgrown the album as a format, or at the
Yeah.
very least kind of, evolved or become in what they are, moved to the point where the album format kind of feels like it limits what Gorillaz want to do more than it kind of complements it. And I've always
Compilations feel optimal for them at this point in
yeah, and
their
I was having
career.
this conversation with our friend Jacob Sanchez yesterday, who loves Gorillaz and is much more positive on this new record and basically anything they've put out than I am. And I wanted to get his perspective. And we basically kind of agreed that even though he was a much bigger fan of Gorillaz than me, they kind of are in a lot of ways the 21st century's definitive singles band by
Yeah,
design in a
for
certain
sure.
extent, because their albums, each album feels like it's constructed to be this kind of compilation essentially of all these
Hmm.
different things that are happening that represent, in their view, or ideally the kind of apex of where they're at creatively. And I think if you take the best stuff from every Gorillaz album and you put it together into one big playlist or one big compilation, you'd have what I said on Twitter would be, like the ideal playlist for like mid-volume background party music, right? Which sounds
Yeah,
kind of, it sounds kind of like I'm insulting it, and I maybe kind of am a little bit, but you need to have music for that setting, and Gorillaz
yeah.
like are so well suited to that. It's not music that is complete wallpaper. There's always something going on that feels like a genuine sort of creative choice that doesn't feel like it's just AI generated. But there's a ceiling to a certain extent.
Well,
How Gorillaz have evolved is to sit in this place and to be essentially Spotify playlist fodder, more or less. And somewhere along the way, I don't know whether it's just the fact that their aspirations, or at least what I perceive to be their aspirations, were something that was kind of out of their reach or maybe overly ambitious, whatever it is, they've kind of ended up in the situation for me where they sort of just exist now, and they sort of just release music, and it sort of just feels like, Gorillaz generating Gorillaz songs very disaffectedly and with very little passion or commitment. It's kind of starting to feel a little bit, I hate to use this term as a kind of descriptor, but it is starting to feel a little bit kind of like AI generated Gorillaz. And I wouldn't be surprised if, as a gimmick, Damon Albarn decides, hey, it might be fun to let Chat GPT write the next Gorillaz album or whatever, because that's the kind
I
of
mean that viral video that's been going around Twitter the last week is him people discovering that the very popular single that is it Clint Eastwood, the song that is basically a wholesale ripoff of a keyboard preset that was on something that he was working with, which I don't think that's inherently bad, by the way, but I think that shows you where Damon Albarn's creative proclivities lie and where his interests lie, and his sort of like inclinations to sort of pervert and adopt established aesthetics and turn it into something else. And I feel like the source of that being like this sort of the idea of like the AI generated thing, like it just doesn't feel a million miles away. I think there's some real credence to what you're saying, really.
And yeah, and look, I think that, again, I'm not saying all of this inherently pejoratively. Like if Damon Albarn was going to move in a
No,
direction where
no.
he kind of starts using these evolving technologies more and more, it would be, I think, very much fitting with the idea of, the kind of progressive techno-futuristic notion of what Gorillaz have always been. But to bring things to the present day, we've got this new album. It's called Cracker Island, which that's a whole thing. Named after the big single, the opening track, the lead song that was the most significant piece of media that preceded the album itself. And yeah, and basically what I was saying, everything about how, because Gorillaz, after the 7-year gap between, I think, The Fall and Humans, they've kind of settled into a groove now where they release records, or they assembled groupings of music fairly regularly now.
I suppose technically speaking, this is an album.
Well, it is. I mean, we can make jokes about it, but it is the latest Gorillaz album, and it really does highlight a lot of what I was saying about how this format seems particularly ill-suited to Gorillaz in terms of achieving what they want to achieve, or at least the best vision of what they can be, which is this, as they themselves dub them, kind of song machine, essentially, who can kind of churn out Gorillaz type beat stuff and give you that satisfying basic thing that you want when you come to Gorillaz. But when you stack it up and make it into an album, it's just not there. It just doesn't work in this format. And part of it is because, again, Gorillaz aren't well suited to this format very much anymore, but also because, again, the inherent ability to craft great songs, great hooks, great melodies, all these sorts of essential things to what made records like Demon Days and Plastic Beach stand out so much are skills that seem to have evaded Albarn and Hewlett more and more in these recent eras as well. I mean, that was my biggest problem with Humans. It wasn't just, that it was a big kaleidoscopic mess or whatever. In fact, that was probably the most appealing aspect of it. It was just that a lot of those songs didn't feel like songs. They didn't feel like they had anything more than what was given to you at very face value, like this artist singing or rapping over this very basically stereotypical thing you would expect them to be appearing on. And this has kind of become more and more true of Gorillaz. And Cracker Island, I think, I can't say that album title without, just being like, why the fuck did you call it that?
Why the fuck did they call it that? And why in God's holy name is that the album cover?
It's so bad.
Why?
It's a terrible album cover. Like, first of all, you can't even read the title of the album. And of course, the band's logo is so small that it's barely even recognizable.
And it's got random motion blur on the characters, but like not all of them.
From an aesthetic standpoint as well, there's no sense of direction or clear idea expressed with it as well. The colors feel very random. It feels very AI generated, and maybe it is.
Yes.
Maybe that's the point. But it gives me, it's not inviting whatsoever.
It feels like I'm scrolling through Reddit, and then like an ad pops up for like the Gorillaz subreddit, and it's just like, I made this fake Gorillaz album cover using fucking Blender or whatever fucking AI program, and I put the characters on it. Look, what do you think, guys?
It just doesn't bode well. It doesn't give you much of an idea of, tonally what you can expect. I mean, it kind of, I guess, is supposed to evoke a kind of party atmosphere, but it doesn't do that very well. And okay, so where to start with this? I think maybe the place where I'll start is that what do we associate with Gorillaz? What is Gorillaz' sort of greatest strength? And what is the thing that is most memorable or most distinct about Gorillaz as a prospect? Is how good they are at collaborations, right? How good they are at bringing artists on and creating a space for those artists to be memorable, to deliver these kind of, perfect executions of what we know them as, who we are, in the context of this kind of more freewheeling, maybe slightly less, I don't know, giving them a kind of opportunity to be themselves and do something in a context that wouldn't normally maybe do in their own projects, right? The features on this album, the best ones are unmemorable. The best ones are kind of just perfunctory. The best ones kind of just exist.
Half of them barely sound like they're there. Like, again, I told you before we recorded that if I didn't look at some of these on Rate Your Music and have like all of the features listed, I genuinely would not know that some of these people are on these songs.
Well, look, the best one I think is Bad Bunny on Tormenta, because Bad Bunny is basically the only feature on this album that has actual charisma to it. I mean, when Bad Bunny is on this song, like when Bad Bunny is actually performing, I feel more animated. I feel more of a sense of actual energy, and I feel more of a sense of an actual performance happening than I do on basically any other part of this album. So that's the best feature on the record, I think.
Which is the lowest rated track on the album. It's weird as hell.
Well, forget about average ratings or that sort of thing, because I don't even think that's the worst song on the album.
I'm just trying to like the average Gorillaz fan being averse to this, where it's like, I agree with you. I think this is the best I'd say it's a toss up between this and Thundercat, really, for the best feature on the album. But like, this is one where I really do feel like this is a good idea for them as a band. And, also, like, you want to go for things that animate people, that get people excited, and for artists that are big. And Bad Bunny is probably the biggest artist on here right now that's going to draw the most people in. But at the same time, it really throws this album's shortcomings into the spotlight, because Bad Bunny is also the only good thing about this song. The incredibly stiff, digitized beat that contrasts against him is so fucking boring.
In one stroke, it feels like, oh yeah, of course Gorillaz would do a song like this, would capitalize on the Latin pop, and it's kind of crazy they haven't done it this blatantly sooner. So of course they would, but also at the same time, as soon as you have, I mean, it's probably for the best that Albarn's vocal presence on the song is minimized compared to some of the other tracks on here as well. But it does feel very much like, what am I getting from this that I couldn't just get from listening to Bad Bunny's record or from listening to any of the huge singles that Bad Bunny has put out? And it feels very perfunctory. And that's basically where I fall on it. I don't have any more to say about the song. It feels very perfunctory. I would agree with you that Thundercat's contribution to the title track, the opening song of this record, is also a highlight as well. I mean, Thundercat playing bass
easily
is, I mean, particularly with the tones that he gets and the the weighty sound that he is famous for. I mean, it's only going to be a strength. It's definitely my favorite part of this song as well, which is just a little bit. It's just too Gorillaz for me. It's clunky. It feels a little bit, I don't know. It's not my thing, but I appreciate that it has this actual weight to it. And actually, that's another compliment I'll give the record as well, is that I think that by and large, it's actually pretty well produced as well. I mean, Albarn is great. Albarn is a really good producer. He's great at taking these, what can often sound or risk sounding quite hokey and quite chintzy, and he can find a good way of giving them some decent weight and decent muscle. Helps that, of course, you have Greg Kurstin helping with the production and mixing of this record as well. Legendary pop producer, one of the most reliable hands in the world. You get Greg Kurstin on to produce a track, it's going to sound great. So I will give the record that. Third best feature, and this is where we get into the territory of basically, I don't really have anything good to say about this feature. It could have been handled more poorly, I suppose. Well, no, it was handled poorly. In fact, this is why I don't think it's a great feature. And it's on my favorite song on the record, which is the second track, Oil, the Stevie Nicks feature.
Yeah, agree. 100%.
I think this song is really strong. Like, I think that
I do too.
I like the production on this. I like production on the rest of the record, but I think that the actual melodies and the music itself, it really stands out. I enjoy the song. I enjoy the fact that Stevie Nicks is on it. And here's where it happens, because and I'm going to sound a little bit, I don't know, Rick Beato-esque here. Forgive me. Who wants to hear Stevie Nicks on a song with this vocal processing that makes her sound like soap? Like, her voice is just completely...
I'm sorry, but that is a totally valid complaint to render with this song. When I see Gorillaz featuring Stevie Nicks, my like the entire point here is that you want to capitalize on the artist's strengths here. So why are you washing her out with all of this nonsense? Like, it would just be a better song.
Like, so much of what makes her obviously a magnetic and amazing performer is in what she can do with her voice. And it is strange to have her not just minimized. I mean, she is definitely audible and she could have been put lower in the mix than she was. I'm glad she wasn't. But it's just, what gets me is the synthetic, complete lathering that's covering her voice and just kind of removing so much of the personality and the elements that make it stand out. I still like the song a lot. I still think the song really works.
Me too.
It just works in spite of how Nix's feature is treated rather than because of it. And then you're just beyond that, feature-wise, you're just in complete anonymity territory for the most part. Tame Impala shows up on New Gold. Jake was joking with me before we started recording that he had no idea that was Tame Impala until looking at the credits right now, which is really funny. And I mean, this is the thing, is you don't even notice it as a feature when you hear the song, because it is just completely doing nothing. It is pure. Same
with Possession Island with Beck. Like, I mean, fucking hell, man.
Look, I could talk about the last 10 years of Beck's career for a literal hour, but you get Beck on a song here, and you put him on the fucking weepy ballad at the very end of the album. I mean, again, just utilizing none of his strengths whatsoever and none of the personality that he can bring to music and that he has for so many years, although, not of late. But the worst feature on here, and this is not, and it's not the worst song on the record. I mean, I've got a whole thing about the first song on the record. And I think from our ratings that we basically agree on this, but we'll get to it. We'll get to it eventually. But the worst feature on this record, and this is not just because it's a bad feature. It is a bad feature. It is a guest verse that is some of the worst written lyrics that I've seen in a newly released song on a record that we're reviewing in some time. And it really sucks because it is from a living legend, Booty Brown of the Far Side, who has collaborated with Gorillaz before, most notably on Dirty Harry off of Demon Days, one of their most enduring songs, and returns here. This is the same track as Tame Impala, New Gold, returns here to deliver one of the worst verses in recent memory. And one of the most galling things about this verse is the deliberate reference to Deer. So deliberate reference to the Demon Days era, like Sean, he's a writer, took on the Deer, of course, referring to Sean Ryder of Happy Mondays and his feature on that song. But then you get some of the most, these lyrics. I mean, this is a person, this is a founding member of the Far Side we're talking about here. Mm-hmm. And he's dropping bars like, trending on Twitter is what some of us live for. Friendships here, but now fucking revolving door. All of this a joke? Holy sure. Bullshit keeps coming. Maybe I'm a matador.
This is fucking Logic tier shit, man.
Logic is one of the exact reference points I thought of while listening to this. It's not a long verse, which makes it even more impressive that every single thing he says in it is asinine at best. And it's just a complete, and I don't know whether to blame Booty Brown here. I mean, obviously he deserves some of the blame. He wrote the lyrics, or whether to just blame the fact that Gorillaz have kind of not even evolved, but sort of existed to a point now where this kind of asinine, low effort sort of slop feels sort of par for the course from what you would expect. It's all just functional. And that's a good way of describing this, is that it is all very much just a functional Gorillaz record. There are individual moments or aspects of certain songs, like Silent Running has a decently memorable hook. Baby Queen has a few elements that stuck in my head as well that I like with some of the things that Damon does vocally. I already mentioned as well, I think Tormenta, while feeling a little bit bizarre of a pivot for Gorillaz, I appreciate the attempt in that particular case to branch out a little bit there. But we have to talk about the worst song on this album. We have to talk about... Yeah, you know where we're going. Yeah. Skinny Ape. So we're going to talk about the song Skinny Ape. I had a moment yesterday, or a few days ago from the time that you'll be listening to this, I had a moment yesterday where I posted some of the lyrics of the song on Twitter. I posted the part in the hook where he's like... what does he say exactly? Oh, don't be sad for me. I'm a cartoon G, which is just some of the worst things I've ever heard come out of Damon Albarn's mouth, but also some of the funniest as well, because there's no way you can hear Damon Albarn, what is he, 55, saying that with a straight face. So I posted that and I said, this is the funniest thing Damon Albarn has ever sung in a song. And I not instantly, actually, a few hours later, got quote tweeted by my most famous follower, John Darnielle of the Mountain Goats, who was making a crack about this exact line as well. And he compared it to that meme that's been going around about how Damon Albarn writes hooks in Gorillaz, where he's like, what is it?
It's the Flimsy Steve tweet.
Flimsy Steve.
He made a song out of the Flimsy Steve tweet.
Well, and this thing, I can't tell whether he's doing that or he's evoking that kind of... Because the thing about the Flimsy Steve meme is the point of that is that it highlights this juxtaposition that happens a lot in Gorillaz songs, where you have this very animated and often quite kind of boisterous and colorful performance from a guest feature artist, and then Damon Albarn comes in to sing this bizarrely, completely ill-fitting, melancholic, sleepy hook that completely feels as though it's at complete tonal odds with whatever else is going on in the song. And this is, of course, it's a joke about how obviously limited of a performer Damon Albarn is. And it's something that I'm sure he's aware of. It's something that he kind of leans into. He tries to find ways to make himself work in these songs. And a lot of the time, it doesn't work because it just feels like the energy of these performers who come into this song builds up and gives you this real sense of motion that he only deflates with his hooks. And look, sometimes he writes really good hooks and it works. That he was really able to do that on Demon Days and Plastic Beach. That's why a lot of the big singles on that album really work, is because he is able to find a way to make his limited range work. But the more Gorillaz go on, it's kind of a little bit like Eminem in that certain sense, where it's like Eminem's never been really good at hooks, and his hooks have always kind of felt very stale, even in his primary period. But in his peak era, he was able to, even though he was really bad at melody, right? And he would always try to give melody to his hooks, and it would feel very forced and very ugly. But he was able to kind of brute force it into this territory. And he had this kind of self-awareness of his limitations and could kind of lean into them. Whereas nowadays, modern Eminem, there's none of that kind of working around the limitations of what Eminem can do melodically. It's just kind of forcing a hook into the song that doesn't work at all and completely takes you out of whatever energy his actual skill, which is in rapping, might have been giving you. And Damon Albarn is kind of like that, except it's his relationship with the people who perform on his songs. And look, that happens. I mean, Skinny Ape, to be fair, it's not even a song with a feature. It's just a proper, album cut Gorillaz track. But it's not, so there's no contrast in the song that makes it funny. It's just a constant slog of bizarre, anonymous, non-functional, non-starting musical ideas. And especially with that, the ape ad-libs, the constant fucking ape ad-libs. And
every single line is punctuated by the flat, monotone, echoed delivery of ape.
And then it's like, and you get to the so it's this functional but boring and bizarrely just terrible Gorillaz template, right, for the first 2/3 of it. And then you get this fucking rave breakdown section
at
the end of the song that it feels like it feels like the song itself is just thrown up out of disgust with itself, and we're just kind of wading through
what the fuck
intro.
do I do with this? What the fuck? I've just been sitting here
skinny little
saying ape the whole time. What do I do?
Skinny little
ape, and it's just like, what the fuck what are you doing, man? Like, I know that this has never been your strong suit or anything, but it really just feels like you've not only gone into a parody of what already feels like, Gorillaz' traditional sort of style is to be somewhat parodic in their approach to music, because that's baked into the concept of what they are. But it feels like he's just doubled over, just gone right upside in his own asshole. And he is just like, this song can be effectively demonstrated as All My Apes Gone, the song. It's all like, it's either Damon Albarn nonsense lyrics that are like, if I go into the optics of what these lyrics are supposed to like mean, and I get it, Gorillaz lyrics, blah blah.
Well,
but like, listen, I have to focus on these things because this is a song. This is like you said, this is an album cut. There's no contrast here. I have to focus on what he's saying because there's nothing else here, and it's empty. And the rest of it is just this whole thing with this the overriding theme of this album, which is only touched upon maybe 50% of the time, is just this overly online kind of like, this is actually an album that I kept thinking of when listening to this, that this is this year's OK Human, in more respects than just one, but especially in the just being like so crushingly, overwhelmingly boomerific in your approach to the screens, being online. What if being online it didn't bring us together? What if it actually took us apart instead, man? And it's like,
well, yeah, this is a core conflict that is a big part of the reason why the album doesn't work, is that and I'm not saying that this is not something Damon Albarn shouldn't try or isn't interesting as a proposition.
It's
But this
okay.
is a
I'll say
very
it.
this is a very jaded album. Like conceptually, it is about being tired. It is about being alienated by the place that you live in, and obviously that is is at conflict with, I think, what most of Gorillaz music is best at doing and best at being about, best at being a kind of celebration, best at being something that makes you feel that you can cut loose a little bit. And I'm not saying Gorillaz shouldn't try and do something a bit darker than that, or try counter that or whatever. And also, like, you were saying, oh, of course Gorillaz lyrics are perfunctory, not to look into them. No, they want you to. The lyrics are not perfunctory. Like, the lyrics are very important.
Absolutely.
Because this is all lore. I didn't pick up on this
Yeah?
until I started sitting down on the Genius page. These songs aren't just, it's not just Damon Albarn putting whatever in there to fill these gaps. This is supposed to continue to tell the story of the characters in the band. Skinny Ape is about, I'm told, according to Genius, that Skinny Ape is from the perspective of 2D, the band's fictional singer-songwriter who's had an abusive relationship at the hand of the band's leader and bassist Murdoch Nichols, who physically abused him for years, and now he seems in this song to be moving on, becoming happier, wanting a new beginning, escaping the cloud of, the expectations and the abuse that he has suffered and all that sort of... I swear to God, this is all supposed to be serious. So there's no need to, make apologies for reading into or criticizing this lyrically, because that is
inventing the Gorillaz fan that is profoundly moved by the emotional core of Skinny Ape.
Hey, look, maybe this is just some rando, completely making all this up on Genius. But even if it is, there is at least one person who is completely taken in by and profoundly affected by the narrative that Gorillaz are crafting. And I'm too old for this, right? I mean, I don't have the time and I don't care. And I know we're reviewing this, so we've got to, put the effort in. We've got to demonstrate a basic level of respect for the art. And I respect Damon Albarn as an artist. I'll always give him the time of day because he's made a lot of great music. And I think he is someone who has a creative vision.
13, amazing record.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. And Plastic Beach, not an album I love front to back, but an album that has a really cool concept and an album that does really interesting things with that and uses the features and the atmosphere and everything about it musically to really...
The ideal Gorillaz album, truly. Yeah.
So, look, all of that, great, superb. I don't need this. I don't know what I can get from this. I mean, it's also worth noting that Damon Albarn did say in an interview that he was partially inspired while writing the song by imagining the life of an Amazon delivery bot. So, there's that. There's this kind of profound, I guess, insight into the, self-awareness of future technology that we enslave. I don't... Look, cool, great. The song sucks.
See, okay, that's the thing I kept coming to this album, because I've listened to this a fair bit more than album we usually feel this way about, just because I felt the incentive to, just because Gorillaz are an artist that, like, on paper I feel like I should love. And we kind of went over this in our episode where we covered them a bit more extensively, but I felt the need to understand, especially I was just like, this is being well received in Gorillaz fan base either. They aren't being particularly receptive to this. A lot of people are even saying that this is their worst album by merit of it being like their most boring. Like, a lot of people will say that Humans is a messier record, but albeit a more interesting one. And I can totally get behind that. But I think a lot of what causes a disconnect for me on this record is, other than the fact that I can't emphasize enough how insane the disparity of my enjoyment of this record is from the first two songs and everything else. Because I really do mean it when I say that the title track with Thundercat and Oil with Stevie Nicks, those are very good songs. I really enjoy them. I would put them in like a permanent rotation playlist of just like fun little pop songs to play when, you just want to have some fun, or you're in the car. It's nice. They're good. I like them. And then the rest of this album is a fucking power nap. It's fucking 32 minutes of inane, droning, vaguely British reverbed vocals, and like, yes, the production's nice, but that's it. It's nice. It sounds good. And you're just kind of, it's very much like how I felt about what I've heard from the Now, which is also an album that sounds nice, I guess, but is also like, that's kind of the limit of its appeal. And then you have that problem already, where the whole record, for the most part, is just a total non-starter. But the actual angle it approaches its concept from, where it's trying to do this, like, oh, I'm gonna try and inhabit the mindset of the Amazon delivery person, or I'm trying to do all these things, and the sort of defense for these ideas, hypothetically, I suppose, is, oh, the inanity of some of these lyrics and some of these, song choices and like ideas is supposed to reflect that which it is interpreting. It's supposed to be a reflection of the modern world in that respect. And I don't know how to tell you this, but if you translate that without adding something to make it interesting, it's not an idea worth pursuing. If you can't add something to make that interesting to the listener, which I think it's kind of inarguable that this album just sort of fails at. Like, this isn't coming from the perspective of, not the biggest Gorillaz fan. It's just like, this just has failed to animate people, from what I can tell. And that seems to be the reception that it's gotten. And I don't understand the artistic inclination at this point to want to interpret these ideas, and then that's it. It's just this stale bread idea of wanting to be like, oh, it's a reflection of how, everything in society is like trying to, like, I'm trying to get on the wavelength of these people, because we've talked about albums that do this so many times in the last 3 years, and it's getting tiring. And at this point, I have a desire to want to engage with it, because I know it's not going away. And to some extent, I empathize with it, because I am also inundated by our modern reality to some extent. But I just, like, you need an X factor. You need a special something. And when you're an artist like Gorillaz, that's your appeal. Like, you are the X factor. Like, what, like, you need to have this idea, this core central conceit. You have to be like, oh, we're gonna do this, and then we're gonna twist it, we're gonna elaborate upon it, and you're just not. Damon, you're old. Maybe we just need to stop.
I would just like, at the very least, for each Gorillaz record to have a clear, discernible point to its existence. I don't need it to be something massively, multifaceted or, super and crazy meaningful or whatever. But I would like to feel like with each Gorillaz album, I'm getting something discernibly having an identity of its own. And that is maybe the biggest way in which Cracker Island fails, above and beyond the songs, being us. It's just that there's no clear identity, and there's vague ideas of, general malaise, but a complete fatigue that kind of clouds it completely. Okay, let's move on now to our second review of the day, which is a much more interesting and much more substantive record, thankfully. Something I've been quite excited to talk about ever since I first heard it, but even beyond that, before that, when it was first announced, and when I had some idea of the kind of shape that it was going to take, especially some of the collaborators that were announced on it as well. I've been very excited from this. So now we're going to talk about the new album from Algiers, Shook. Algiers are a difficult band to describe. They originally formed in 2012 in Atlanta, Georgia, by frontman Franklin James Fisher, one of the most distinctive voices of his era, I would say. Someone whose massive, booming, declarative voice is basically the most defining and distinctive feature that carries across all the music that they've made. But you also have bassist and keyboard player Ryan Mahan, fellow guitarist and programmer Lee Tish, and of course drummer Matt Tong, who you may know as the founding drummer of Block Party as well, all coming together to form this fascinating project that originally, because I've been following Algiers ever since they first formed, I was just aware of them as, hey, here's this new post-punk band coming out. I think in around 2014 they first kind of showed up. And Matt Tong from Block Party, this is the band that he left Block Party to be in. So I was like, okay, cool. Very interested, very intrigued. They came out with their debut album, their self-titled record in 2015. A very dark and morose, but also booming bit of sort of industrial post-punk that definitely stood out as a very unique proposition at that time as well. I feel like a lot of the innovation that Algiers demonstrated, or at least some of the particular characteristics of what they were doing there, this distinct gothic post-punk and heavily industrial tinged music with sort of slight soulful gospel elements as well, ended up kind of being a shtick that was taken by other artists and done in different ways, often in less creative ways, that would ultimately garner more attention as well. I mean, part of the reason why I've always kind of struggled to get on board the Idols train, even when they were quote unquote good, is that I kind of felt like they were always sort of just doing what Algiers did, except not as interestingly and a little bit more, kind of like British white guy. But their credit where due, I'm not going to throw shots at anyone today. Algiers came forward with this fantastic declarative debut that, like I said, integrated all these aggressive, dark, gothic sounds with these very heavily left-wing polemical lyricism and this distinct perspective forged in fury, essentially. And it was this kind of, almost apocalyptic sense of retribution, essentially, on behalf of Black Americans and, Black and African people in general. And Franklin James Fisher positioned himself, not to say that he was someone who came with any great degree of ego, but he definitely positioned himself as the frontman of this band in a very sort of like, in a way where he commanded attention. And I always thought that that debut record, while, it probably is sort of more the kind of promising debut than the out and out great album from the get-go, I still think that record is a little bit underrated. I still think that record stands out as one of the most unique and exciting albums of 2015. But it definitely became superseded by their 2017 record, The Underside of Power, which felt like it capitalized on all of the best elements of that self-titled debut and added about 6 or 7 more new things into the mix as well that all worked. This was one of my absolute favorite albums of that year. Definitely one of my most listened to albums of that year as well. It definitely foregrounded the post-punk and industrial elements, but brought the gospel elements up to meet them halfway, integrated these sort of quote unquote industrial hip hop elements and even noise rock elements as well, to the point where all of these different, this miasma of musical influences were so intertwined and interlinked that basically the attempt to describe how Algiers sounded, was almost deliberately a foolish task. It was angry music. It's aggressive music. It's also music that is deeply melancholic and deeply filled with this sense of flowing emotion, complicated flowing emotion as well. There's rage, there's sorrow, there's regret, there is animation of all kinds, but it is never this two-dimensional thing. And that record to me is, it's imposing in its power and still stands out to me as one of the most creative albums of the entire 2010s. And so that is a fantastic record. And someday we might even talk about it in a record club. I have debated it here and there, but maybe we'll let a little bit more time pass because Algiers is still giving us new material to talk about. Interestingly, their follow-up to this album was 2020's There Is No Year, which, before I briefly mentioned that, I want to say it was preceded by a single called Can the Sub Bass Speak, which came out in mid to late 2019. I remember this single coming out because it's one of the most, I think, significant moments in Algiers' career. Gets a little bit overlooked because the song never ended up on an album, but it was this brutal, intense spoken word piece, essentially, that was just this avenue for Franklin James Fisher to basically excoriate every reviewer or music journalist or random internet person who had taken it upon themselves to interpret or to graft some kind of goal or pretension onto what Franklin and his band do. And it is just one of the most vitriolic, brutal, and completely uncompromising diss tracks to the haters or whatever that I've ever heard. Completely just almost incomprehensible piece of music as well, because there's very little actual music in it. It utilizes free jazz elements as well. It showcased the band heading into this much more esoteric direction that very much fascinated me. And then the album that this was sort of building up to arrived, and it's called This Is No Year. It came out in January of 2020. Definitely a record that got memory hold and sort of very easily fell into the gaps of early 2020 for reasons obviously outside of the band's control. But also, it's a fascinating record because it felt like it was deliberately underwhelming in certain senses, and I'm not trying to like redeem what doesn't work about this record by ascribing purpose to it, but there's definitely this sense with which Franklin, and I got this vibe, you know, thinking about it retrospectively based on Can the Sub Bass Speak, that song, that Franklin had grown disillusioned with what he felt this project could do, what he felt his artistic vision and, you know, his music and his band were able to do versus what his initial goals were. This sense of, you know, disillusionment with the idea of making music, with the idea of making art, with the idea that art can have actual power. Franklin on that record was, you know, it's a very despondent and hopeless album. It's an album that, you know, doesn't ring with the righteousness of, you know, the struggle ahead, but actually feels as though it's capitulating under the weight of, you know, the empty meaninglessness of all of the protest that goes nowhere or seems to go nowhere, right? And you can understand where he comes from as well. It's not an experience that, you know, I can comment on, but it made it a very alienating album to listen to as an Algiers fan as well, because so much of the energy and animation and just sort of brutality that made their two previous records feel so exciting was just not there. It's an album that sounds like it's made by very depressed people. And also a lot of the grit and the, you know, the noise rock elements and the kind of raw sounds that Algiers were bringing into the mix were kind of stripped away for this very synthetic, minimal aesthetic on this album as well, that felt like Algiers were equally shying away from the things that made them musically interesting, as well as the energy and the spirit that made them feel so essential. So it's an interesting sort of response to where we're at sort of album. I can't say I enjoyed all that much, but I did come back to it this week and I understood it more in context, and I understood why it underwhelmed me and kind of why I suppose the band needed to make a record like that. I'm sure they probably think of it more fondly than I do, but it did feel like an album where Algiers were, you know, whether intentionally or not, kind of shooting a hole into their momentum. So 3 years later, we're back with Shook, which instantly, I mean, what a great album title, right? Especially for you know, this kind of record and the kind of music that Algiers make. You know, obviously it is a word that is, you know, it's heavily tied to African-American vernacular English, and it has these very clear, you know, evocations and ideas. And it's just a very powerful sound as well, you know, even divorced from meaning. You have this album cover as well that has this sort of like stylized picture of this almost rabid looking dog on the front cover that has got a chain in its mouth. And you get this real sense of, you know, that kind of characteristic righteous fury that you associate with earlier Algiers. And coming into it, I was like, yeah, okay, yeah, sure, definitely. I want Algiers to return to that violent energy that made their early music so exciting to me, you know, casual music listening white person. But I also want Algiers to be true to wherever they're at artistically as well. And I especially don't want them to feel as though they have to make this deliberately intense and aggressive and all these sorts of things kind of album to, you know, satisfy any kind of audience that they've, you know, cultivated, or, you know, to win back people who tuned out with the last album. And it was foolish to think they might do that, because of course they wouldn't do that. I mean, why would Algiers give a fuck about what anyone thinks? So fittingly, Shook is an album that both feels as though a return to form in some senses, in the sense that it brings back some of that vitality and energy of their earlier music, but also is grittier, is darker, is moodier in its own way, is even more sort of disregarding of convention, right? It's even harder than ever before, I think, to ascribe a genre to what Algiers do. It's not post-punk, it's not hip-hop, it's not soul, but all elements of those things are all a part of the toolkit. And, you know, it is just quintessentially black music. Essentially, it is black music through and through, and it is about the history of the art form, and it is drawing from different aspects and aesthetics of history and culture and all those sorts of things, and doing that. And it is an album as well where they're bringing collaborators into the fold, which is something they haven't really done before. I mean, this is a record that, this is the thing, when it was announced, one of the things that really grabbed my attention was the fact that it had collaborators at all for Algiers, but also some of the names on here. You got Zach De La Rocha's on here from Rage Against the Machine. You got Billy Woods and Backwash. You got Samuel T. Hearing from Future Islands, which was maybe the most confusing one to me. But hey, I was on board for it. And of course, a bunch of other artists as well who I wasn't familiar with, but I knew would be Algiers exposing me to, to people who were a big influence to them or a big part of their world. And so I was incredibly excited for this, especially excited for the fact that it appeared to be a little bit more sprawling as well. It appeared to be this record that is going to give Algiers a chance to, essentially explore more ideas than they have before, and kind of just let their music breathe in a way that they haven't really done before. Because this is the thing about Algiers, even in their more stripped back, more recent material, is that there's this sense of claustrophobia to a lot of music that they do. It's tightly wound, it's intense, it's putting you inside of a moment, and it is not a pleasant one to be inside. And there's moments on this that are like that as well. And one of the most kind of starkly arresting and sort of haunting moments on this album is the song Something Wrong, which kind of almost in slow motion describes this experience of, being a Black person being pulled over by police and having this encounter essentially that goes south very quickly, but it happens in slow motion. It's a long song, and it's just this almost avant-garde, sort of very minimal echoes of elements of gospel and soul and post-industrial and all that sort of stuff, just providing this landscape for this increasingly tense, story that's being told that eventually ends in, this cop essentially screaming at Franklin or whoever the main character is, and this refrain of get out of the car and don't fight back and get on the ground and all that sort of stuff. And so there's moments like this that are, because of the way the album is set up, because of the ebb and flow of the way that it structures as well, these moments hit with this different energy than they might have on a previous record, where you're just getting that constant bombardment. Here there's a sense of unpredictability to what this album is. And it's the unpredictability that I love about Algiers. There's the sense that there is no clear criteria. There's no template for what this will be or what it will turn into. And it means that, this is a record that's gotten very little attention. I know that Algiers don't, I guess, they're signed to Matador, actually, which surprises me because that's a pretty big, significant label. You would think that label would put more push behind publicizing this, and yet I've seen very few reviews of this. I've seen basically almost no one talking about it. It's very much gone under the radar, which makes me very sad, because what Algiers are doing here is, I think, again, like they were doing in the mid-2000s, some of the most innovative and just completely untied to a clear convention music that's happening right now. And no one is really appreciating it. No one is really kind of drawn to it. No one is giving it the kind of air that, other artists or other records doing similar things that just have that additional connection to publicity or, this following from their online circles or whatever get. I think that it's a real shame that Algiers appear to sort of be going under the radar, that maybe the cold, frosty reception to their last album kind of meant that people sort of permanently tuned out of what they were doing. I don't know what it is, but it also means that because of the nature of this album, the way that it is, its length, its very sort of unusual structure, and its flow that is not exactly, lightning fast or whatever, it's not an easy record to wrap your head around. And I've needed to spend a bit of time with it this week, especially in the last few days where I've had it just sort of more regularly in my rotation, just kind of trying to absorb it a little bit more. And, quite predictably, as I've done that, I've got to appreciate more and more what it's doing. But yeah, I mean, there's lots to get into. There's lots of interesting aspects of it musically that I've kind of alluded to, but haven't really touched on. But Jake, I want to throw to you at this point as well. I know you're a fan of Underside of Power. I know that you've probably been as cognizant of Algiers as I have been, basically ever since I probably introduced you to them. I think I remember introducing you to them, or not introducing you to them, but I remember like us talking about them and them being a band that we kind of bonded over, one of the many bands that we kind of bonded over early in our friendship. So I'm curious about your experience with the band, your overall thoughts on the band, and then going into this record, what you're hoping for, what you got, and what your sort of general thoughts are before we get into the specifics.
Yeah, Underside of Power was an album that really kind of confounded me when I first heard it because it was one of those albums that was really talked about at the time, and really like a lot of critics were really kind of heralding it as like this really unique, innovative voice in the, dozen of genres that it was dabbling in. And you put on that album, and the first song you hear is Walk Like a Panther, which for my money is maybe one of the 10 most immediately brutal album openers of the 2010s. Just this fucking like blown out screaming, this ridiculous trap hi-hat that's playing in the background. It's a positively filthy song and a great mission statement for the kind of artist that Algiers, were. And the more I listened to that album, the more I sort of appreciated where it was coming from, everything it was fusing together. It kind of reminded me, we talked a lot about artists that are in this specific field, artists like, Backwash we've talked about, or Zealand Ardor, where they're sort of adding this sort of conscious, very, Afrocentric ideas, and then combining them with genres that aren't typically associated with that, and making their own unique spin on it. And in that, they kind of, the innovation just kind of bleeds out through unique combination alone. And I kind of had a similar reaction with There Is No Year. I was just like, oh cool, they're following up the Underside of Power. And that was an album where it just kind of whiffed past me. I was just sort of like, this just isn't really what I come to this band for. So I was like, okay, this is a bit of a misfire for me, but it's not something that makes me any less excited to see what they do in the future. And I do kind of, in hindsight, like I do kind of resent that album a little bit more, just because I do feel like it's halted the momentum of this album. And it's cool that they're doing things on their own terms, and I'm glad that they are, because they so clearly don't give a fuck, and that's part of what makes them great. But it also really frustrates me that an album like this at least isn't just, maybe not even is being received more warmly, but just isn't being talked about more, because everything about this album, from its construction alone, is super thorny. Everything about this album is really unfriendly. But the thing is that all of these things that make it difficult also make it immensely compelling to me. Whereas, there's a lot of ideas here where, in terms of like the transitional tracks, the spoken word parts of this album, the aspects of it that aren't, directly just kind of like straight up Algiers, songs, they're presented differently. Sometimes it'll just be straight up spoken word, sometimes it'll be spoken word with an instrumental, sometimes it'll just be an instrumental. These sort of ideas feel like it's sort of obfuscating what Algiers were originally, and they're trying to go for something a little bit wider, something a little bit more ambitious. And I think one of the biggest things that sort of comes through with what they're doing here is just, you really get the sense of collaboration on this album. It feels like they embrace their features, their collaborators, to such a degree where, we're talking about two albums this week where one of the artists is known for collaborations, is in like the DNA of who they are. And I feel like that on that record is felt so much less strongly than it is here, when you have this band that are known for this very singular voice, and suddenly it feels like a really big group effort. And I feel like that is integral to this album's overarching thesis, which is about perspective, and about multifaceted perspectives, and about how the Black experience isn't a monolith, and how just because it's not a monolith doesn't mean that that detracts from the potency of their message or the immediacy of what they're talking about. They want to convey a sense of interiority to the problems that they're facing, to the perspectives that they have, is really innately compelling. One of the spoken word tracks on here conveys that really well, talking about how, other people, outsiders, coming at them from the perspective of, even they might be trying to like understand them or empathize with them, they can't fathom that they live in an existence that is beyond just suffering. Like they can't fathom that the Black experience in America right now is anything other than hell, that they, they're incapable of feeling happiness just because the things are so bad for Black people right now. And at the same time, it's just like, we are able to experience joy. We are able to have lives, and we are multifaceted people. But at the same time, that doesn't detract from the issues that are still impacting us, and that doesn't change anything. It just that like just the encouragement of viewing them as being multifaceted, breathing, empathic human beings, and everything on here very much encourages that. And I think the thing about that is that all of these things make this album very, as I said before, thorny. Is that this is a longer album. It's it's almost an hour. It's like 55 minutes long. It's got a lot of tracks on here, 17 tracks, and a lot of them are shorter, like interlude stuff that I can certainly understand that breaking up the flow of the album for you, the pacing of the album for you. But I want to do something we don't often do on this show, and I kind of want to defend this creative choice.
I'm
First
planning on doing it as well. So you
oh,
and I are
okay, good.
unified on this.
Awesome. The proper songs on here, like the actual like Algiers cuts on here, are as good as they've ever been, in my opinion. I mean, there are moments on here that absolutely live up to The Underside of Power, which is certainly an album I think is more focused, more unified, and overall more cohesive, and, technically speaking, is better. But it's such a different kind of album that I feel like that kind of misses the point of what this is trying to do. But even still, if you're looking for those hard-hitting, immediate genre-blending moments of that album, they're on here. I mean, for fuck's sake, Bite Back featuring Billy Woods and Backwash is one of the best fucking songs this year, and I do not see it being like dethroned from that status anytime soon, because this song is fucking brutal. I didn't even see that they were on the feature list before I started listening to this, and immediately the first word he says, I'm just like, that's Billy Woods. And then when Backwash comes on here, I was just like, oh, fuck yes. Like, these two are going as hard as they did on their respective records that came out last year, which are two of their best pieces of work.
Mhm.
And on here, they're both hungry, they're vicious, they're angry, and they're backed by Algiers' fucking fantastic production, which, honest to God, Matt Tong on here, be it programmed drums or analog drums, fire the whole thing. I think he's actually, like, honestly just never been better. Sometimes you can't even tell the difference between the two, but he has to work in a really versatile way to sort of cover all of the bases that Algiers are trying to encompass in their sound. And I mean, he does it fucking flawlessly, and no better on songs like this. But man, everything on this song is so great. Just the central idea of, like, the hook coming back to it, of, biting the hand that feeds you if it's poisoned, which I think is a really also just sort of inherently built into the thesis of this record, which is just like the idea of, complacency, where of, the saying of, don't, bite the hand that feeds you. Well, if what the hand is feeding you is poisoned, then fucking bite it anyway. And it's a call to arms. It's a call to agency, and to reflect and to act, and all of these things that I feel like are vital and earnest. And not to mention, just throughout some points on this album, I really do feel like this record encourages the sort of like part of what's frustrating for me, and the way that I've seen lots of critics talk about this album, some of them view the interludes, the different perspectives, the different voices on here as nothing more than, like, not to say they outright say this, but they only treat it as political posturing. And I feel like that displays a lack of willingness to meet this album halfway and to actually listen to what they're saying. It's not whether or not you agree with what they're saying, it's whether or not you're actually listening. It's pushing back against this idea of liberal complacentness, where it's like, it's cool that you agree with us. It's cool that you sympathize and empathize with us. And it's cool that you're on our side. but that doesn't fucking mean anything if you sit on your ass and don't do anything about it. And to me, that is powerful. That forces reflection, that forces, that's a vital thing to say right now. And that has a synergy with, I think, the key to unlocking this album, which is its very, immediately catching title, the idea of shook. And the thing is, with this album structure, with its thorny nature, sometimes it puts two spoken word tracks right after another. It doesn't have a flow that even seems to complement itself. But when you listen to this album more than once, I feel like this has a synergy with what they're going for, in that it constantly keeps you on your toes. Because these songs, I mean, forget song by song. Like, there are songs on here that will just completely devolve into something totally different than what they started out as. I'm talking about songs like Green Iris, for example, which starts out as like being this really kind of soulful, dirgy sort of thing, and then just breaks into this fiery final minute and 30 seconds that is just like, I mean, again, it kind of scared me the first time it happened. And that's the key, is that this album is constantly trying to catch you off your guard. It's trying to put you in a place where you, as a music listener, do not anticipate what is around every corner, what you don't know what to expect. And by throwing a wrench into traditional album construction, they effectively demonstrate trying to communicate thematic and musical ideas and structural ideas all at the same time. Like, again, this is thorny, this is dense, there's a lot going on here, so I understand not being able to be fully on board with it, but at the same time, it deserves better than, the lack of engagement, the detachment that I've been seeing with it so far.
Well, I mean, one thing I think we need to remember as well is that, Algiers don't make music for the kind of people who dominate the circles that we, exist
That's
in
very
as well.
true.
So it may just be that, this album hasn't animated a lot of, hipster white people essentially who are super online, but
Yeah.
maybe it is reaching the audience that it is intended for, and we just aren't, we're not a part of that, so we can't know. But what I'll say, I think the title is really interesting as well, this idea of being shook. And the album explores that in a lot of different ways, both musically and how it's constructed and how that it juxtaposes and contrasts different ideas, how songs play out essentially, and how different kind of shifts might happen. But also, of course, in the experiences that are talked about and the stories that are told and the ideas that you get communicated to you through the medium of language essentially as well, which is a huge part of this. And one of the things I think that's interesting about these spoken word tracks, and even just our inherent inclination to isolate them as distinct from the more conventional music of the record, is I think that Algiers are trying to make a very clear point about how doing that in the first place, it misses the point of why these sorts of albums and why this kind of album construction exists in the first place. And that's that I don't believe Algiers view, the spoken word moments or the interludes as any different or distinct or whatever than the more conventional songs themselves. These are all just different forms of expressing ideas. You have the sung, you have the rapped, and you have the spoken. And there is no need, even though we're talking about music, and I know that that's a whole different thing, but there is no need to create a hierarchy of expression here, whereby expressing something through the medium of rapping is somehow inherently more valuable than expressing something through the sheer means of speaking and just kind of communicating a thought process, essentially. And what Algiers are doing is, obviously, their music is very heavily documenting the Black experience in a lot of different ways. Not just the things that happen, the negative things, the ugliness, the darkness of it all, but also, like you say as well, trying to capture the fuller picture, and also trying to draw attention as well to the point that Algiers don't make this music for white audiences. It's not a song like Comment Number 2, which is the track that is about essentially talking about how we're viewed as by the white, that they're viewed by the white audience as being in a state of constant suffering. That song is not here's something we're going to throw out here for our white audience to let them know what we're really about. It is a song that is putting that out there so that the intended audience, which I presume to be Black people, can relate to that idea, can share in that idea, can have that moment of connection. And so much of what was on this record, whether you're someone who's listening to it from the perspective of being a white observer, or being someone who's a member of the community, or a member of another, racial or cultural community that can empathize with the struggle and the experiences communicated, whatever the intent or whatever the audience that it is reaching, the point is in the communication, the point is in the listening, the point is in the fact that we have all of these different ways to express ourselves. None of them are more valuable or more meaningful or more or less artistic than any other form. And in getting into the semantics of how these different modes of communication are effective artistically, is ultimately diluting the point of the art in the first place. And so what I love about Shook is that it gives you all of these different, not only different kinds of experiences that are being communicated. I particularly am struck by the track, which one was it? All You See Is, as well, where this is this spoken word track where the narrator essentially is talking about the importance of moving past vindictiveness, the importance of moving past holding on to this feeling of constantly wishing harm to the people who've harmed you. Not that that desire is unwarranted, but just that it can be so, it can hold you back and it can control you and it can kind of box you in such a harmful way that this person who is telling this experience of how they were able to get past that and actually wish well for the person that harmed them, freed them in a very different way. And it is the part of the experience. It is the part of, the idea, it is contradicting and it is pushing back against certain stereotypes of that white people hold against black people and how they experience and relate to and think of, people who, in the world around them, and people who've wronged them and all that sort of thing as well. So you have all these different experiences that are, communicated in these different songs and these different modes that create this patchwork of how do we feel? How do we respond to the trauma, to reality, to, the things that bring us joy and the things that make us emotional, all these different ways? What are all the different things that it means to be shook, to be kind of taken aback, to be thrown from a moment and forced to contemplate and forced to reflect and forced to think about how you understand what's happening to you and then how you move forward from it. So that is the overarching thing for the record. And it is it's such an effective statement at getting you to reckon with and understand and, depending on what kind of audience you are and depending on where you're coming from, either relate to, commiserate with, or simply sympathize with what's being communicated. It is a purely, a bit of a trite descriptor here, but it's a very humane record in that way. And again, it gives a stark contrast against There Is No Year, which is just such a pessimistic album by comparison and lacks the kind of diversity of emotional experience that this has. Yeah. And I don't resent that album existing. I feel like it's a record that they needed to make. I resent that people have chosen, or that at least their respective people have chosen not to engage with Algiers as much as they did during the 2000s. But also we have to understand as well that that's also true of a lot of bands who, evolve past the thing that initially made them big, is that they just get less attention anyway. But here we are. I think the songs, as for the music on the album, I think that in being so radically kind of different and difficult to describe, it creates this incredibly alluring experience every time I come back. I'm so taken in by it. There are moments on the album that just grab you and hold you in their grip, and there's like the genuinely hooky moments as well, like in the opening track. I've had that, we shatter, we are crack, trying to walk the line, we are shatter, we are fall, it's a sign of the times. I had that going around in my head for the last 24 hours off and on. That's just a great, pure Algiers.
There's even more hip hop in this album than there was on the underside of Power, I'd wager to say. I
mean, absolutely. I mean, second track, you got Zach De La Rocha coming in here with the guest verse and completely flaming. Like, it's just exactly, it is Algiers kind of taking a moment to kind of fully just dig into that part of, the tradition and part of the patchwork of things that they draw from, and, just doing that banger and having that moment and letting you kind of just feel that, the power of that. Following up track 73% as well, kind of brings up the industrial kind of synthetic edge and gives you a little bit of a continuation of that as well. You have a lot of sort of polemic sort of some of it's spoken word, some of it's not quite spoken word, but a lot of it feels like the stream of consciousness delivery from Franklin as well, where he's kind of talking about and almost kind of ranting and raving essentially about various different points and various different perspectives and things that he is feeling at the particular time. And the formlessness of that is, it's initially alienating to someone who's coming at this from a very coherently structured sort of musical, all right, I've got to review this for a podcast perspective, but in disarming you so much and in making you kind of shake yourself out of that, it allows you to appreciate music in a different way than you normally do and normally would. And that's one of the great things about it. My favorite song on here is the aforementioned Green Iris. The structure of the song, the musical ideas at play here, and the way that it changes towards its end, everything about this is what I love so much about Algiers. I listened to this song this morning and I was trying to think, how do I describe what's musically happening in the different stages of this song? And I was really struggling. Like, yeah, there's this soul sort of gospel, sort of almost sort of hymnal spiritual influence early on, but you have that brushing up against these kind of colder tones that you don't associate with gospel or soul music. This sort of brittle, frosty industrial edge, and you have these, again, this kind of
some of it's outright terrifying sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. And this sort of stream of consciousness vocal delivery as well before the song does, completely explode into the section as Franklin is singing about reclaiming power and glory and recognizing a sound that bears your natural soul. Some of the most beautiful lyrics that I can remember him writing in a while. I mean, it just completely floored me. Took a few listens to do that because, again, I had to shake off so much of the framework that I normally approach records with. And, I'm not saying it's the first album to make me do that. Records do this, on a fairly irregular, but still, reasonably frequent basis. And when it does, it's really, really exciting, and especially when it does it well. So that was something that really, really stood out to me. And yeah, and I think the record as well, towards the end, even as it kind of dissembles from more classical form more and more as it goes on, you still get moments like Cold World as well, which is the kind of classic sort of very straightforward, very catchy, and also very sort of uplifting, which is funny for a song that has, a repeated refrain of "I'm not going to stone you to death" in the song, but it has this this immediacy to it that feels like a reward for wading through some of the more experimental, I guess, moments of the album. And and it's not afraid to leave you after that in a more disorienting place, again, with something wrong, when it's aforementioned terrifying narrative of police brutality, and the more sort of, I suppose, purely exploratory musical ideas of the last couple of tracks that remind me a little bit of like Flying Lotus or something like that. It just feels like the album is never done innovating. It's in it within its own framework and taking itself to new places, and I really love that about it. It's I think one of the year's most unique and interesting records so far. I think that it is absolutely worth a lot of attention, a lot of care as well. I mean, we're just not the most equipped people to fully analyze it, so I'm sure that there are people out there who probably have, and they probably deserve the attention more than we do. But still, at the very least, Algiers are still making incredibly essential music.
Well, not enough people are talking about this, so we have to do our part and at least try to get people talking about it in one way or another, even if we're just two little guys running around.
Absolutely. But yeah, I'm thrilled that they're still around. I'm thrilled that they're still making challenging and awesome and fun and also complicated music that's very, very difficult to initially unpack, and lets you sit in a certain space where you have to think about things in terms of your artistic approach and also in terms of your engagement with a lot of cultural and socio-cultural ideas differently than most works of art make you do. So yeah, shout out to Algiers, keeping it real, still doing really, really awesome and inspiring things. And I hope they keep doing it. I hope they're able to keep doing it. I hope that whatever the reception or the attention or the commercial response to this, that they're able to be put in a position where they can keep making this music, because it really rules, and it's just super important that it exists.
Rarely do you see artists taking advantage of just how messy an album can be without totally shooting themselves in the foot. And, even if that doesn't completely work to your benefit, I feel like it's almost more important to acknowledge when that's happening, just because this is why the current landscape of art and music is so interesting and so unpredictable and fun, is because these guys are a monument to that, of it being unpredictable and it being weird and different and thorny, like I said. So, give this a shot if you haven't, and go into it with the expectation that it's not going to be this immediately hard-hitting thing. You're going to get those moments. You're going to, like, if you like Algiers in the past, you're going to enjoy at least some of the material on here. But, try to go a little bit beyond maybe what you're used to when it comes to listening to an album. Not to like elevate it and say that it's like this, untouchable thing, but it's like sometimes you need to put moderation on yourself as a listener if you want to truly engage with what an artist is doing and what they have to say.
Yes, absolutely. Let us know at home what you think of either of the albums we've discussed today, Gorillaz Cracker Island or Algiers Shook. Do you agree with us? Do you disagree with us? Do you think we were too harsh on Gorillaz? Do you have an alternate perspective on Algiers as well, especially Algiers as well? If you've got thoughts on that, really want to hear from you. Really just want to have a conversation about how cool this album is in the comments below. So let us know what you think. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider giving it a like and subscribing if you have not already. Both those things help us a lot and encourage us to keep doing these analyses. If you are keen on hearing us talk more about music, we'll be back in a couple of days' time talking about the latest in music news, as well as talking about bad albums from great artists, which is going to be a really interesting conversation. And of course, we've got new videos coming out all the time. Basically every 2 or 3 days we have something dropping, so stick around and you'll get a lot more of that. If you want to go above and beyond and support us even more, you can hit the join button. For just $1 a month, you can support us directly, become a member of the Jams and Tea family, and get your name featured in the title crawl of every video on this channel. Plus, if you want to recommend us some music to talk about, your recommendation will go to the top of the pile. As always though, folks, rock over London, rock on Chicago, Ritz. Life's rich.